Hello, everyone. Today we're joined by Pamela Morgan, CEO of Third Key Solutions, a key management consulting company and an expert in blockchain law. How are you doing today, Pamela?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing great. So can you just give me a brief definition of what your view of blockchain governance is?
Oh, that's a big question. I think that one of the most interesting things about this technology is that it provides the opportunity for people to organize in different ways, in ways that aren't necessarily limited by geography, but that can be limited by, for example, values, shared values across a broad geographic area. I think that the current legal system isn't really equipped to deal with the kind of realities that we face with this new technology and being able to share value in a borderless way. And I'm interested to see how we can develop our own sort of systems that will allow us to create societies that we want to create, a more voluntary world.
Interesting. So you mentioned how law doesn't have to be contiguous using blockchain tech. But one of the problems that comes with startup societies and blockchain governance is there tends to be a problem with sovereignty, meaning that the law that is practiced in blockchain law, even though the people that are participating in it voluntarily accept it, it doesn't mean that surrounding states will accept it. For instance, it could even be seen as a black market for law. How do you sort of avoid that with non-contiguous law?
Well, I would like to say that we can declare, sovereignty and create our own systems that are maybe outside of the current systems. But unfortunately, the reality is that the legal systems that we have today, they operate kind of in an all-encompassing default area, if you will. I wrote an article that I call Arial 11. By any chance, do you use Google Docs?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know what font you use if you open a Google Doc and start typing?
I think it's Arial. I'm probably wrong.
It totally is. It's Arial 11. And the reason that I point this out is because if you don't want to use Arial 11, you can make other choices, right? I mean, you can go anywhere from Times New Roman, if you want to be conservative, to a crazy Comic Sans, and you can choose other sizes. But if you don't make a choice, then you're stuck with Arial 11. And the law is much the same way. So there are areas, not the entirety, but there are areas where we can choose alternative law, something different than what the default is. But we have to make an affirmative choice to take those actions. One of the ways that we can do this, and one of my areas of interest, is private dispute resolution through arbitration.
Excellent. And so I'm glad you brought up different law systems in tandem with arbitration. What do you do in a scenario in which two people have two different legal systems that they've attached themselves or subscribed to? How do you adjudicate disputes between them?
Well, there's an entire body of law that's called conflicts of law. And every jurisdiction has default conflict of law provisions. As you might imagine, dealing with all of the jurisdictions that are out there, it's a nightmare to try to figure out what laws apply to you, particularly when you're operating in a Bitcoin or blockchain sort of business. So it's much better to decide early. It's much better to choose choice of law, what laws will apply, what venue will apply, et cetera, when you're going into the agreement, rather than waiting, having a deal with a person, having it fall apart, and then attempting to deal with it through the traditional legal system. This is why many people are afraid, but also many people just recognize that the current legal system doesn't work for most people. And one of the reasons it doesn't is because one of the things that you see when you're practicing law, there's a different mentality between people who practice within businesses and for startups than people who practice in litigation. There's a different mindset. And so those of us who practice on the business side tend to acknowledge and understand that most of the time businesses do not want to be mired in, a decade-long battle. Businesses are not interested in dealing with the traditional legal system, which is why arbitration is such an effective opt-out. And for people who don't know, multinational companies have been using arbitration for decades. This is a well-developed area of law. It's just now everyday people can use it in a meaningful way when we tie arbitration into blockchain and Bitcoin sort of businesses.
Or like with merchant law, they've been doing that for centuries.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the reason is because these well-developed organizations understand the cost and complexity of traditional legal systems, and they've found a way to opt out. What I'm interested in is how can we bring that option of opting out to everyone else?
So yes, this absolutely works with business law. If you go into a contract, you decide beforehand what type of legal system you're going to be adopting. However, this is less so with, let's say, criminal law, in which you're bumping into people that you're not always making contracts with. How do you adjudicate in scenarios like that? Is it best to have a natural monopoly in terms of places where you live, even if it's in like a municipality area, so that you don't have to constantly make new contracts with everyone that you bump up against?
I think that oftentimes people think that these sorts of clauses or these sorts of options are limited only to businesses. But in reality, you can have an arbitration clause in a community organization. You can have an arbitration clause in every organization of human beings. Inevitably, there will be some dispute that arises, and every collection of people will have a way to decide those disputes. I think it's much more fair if the way that those disputes are going to be decided is known upfront by the participants. Some of the interesting points about arbitration that I want to bring up are that there are many more options if you have arbitration. Have you talked about arbitration before on the show?
Not on this show, no.
Okay, so I think that a lot of people will be surprised to learn that there are many, many things that you can do with arbitration that you can't do with traditional court systems. People have many more choices. So for example, you can choose the substantive law, which is what we talked about before, right? What law applies when two people are from different jurisdictions? What is a breach of contract? What is negligence? These sorts of things. But you can also choose the procedural law. So for example, you can say, okay, if you and I have a dispute and you file a claim against me, how long do I have to respond to that dispute? Can I take forever? No, typically dispute resolution systems will have procedural rules in place that say, no, Pamela has to respond to Joe within 21 days, for example. You can choose that with arbitration.
So would precedent, oh, sorry, no problem at all. So would precedent be as applicable to blockchain law as it is to current common law?
Well, this is interesting because you can make a choice. You can say, we are going to take this line of cases, or we're going to incorporate this line of precedent in our agreement and use that as the basis for determining an outcome of a dispute. You have that choice if you choose arbitration. Where we don't have those choices, we don't get to decide who the judges are and what law applies if we avail ourselves of traditional courts. A couple more things you might find interesting. You can also choose venue. You can choose judges. So you can decide who's going to decide your dispute. You can decide the number of judges. You can choose what language the hearings are going to be in. You can choose to not even have a hearing at all. You can choose to have your dispute decided just on documents if you want to do that. You can also decide how confidential you want this dispute resolution to be. It can be completely transparent and open, public, but it can also be completely private and confidential, or somewhere in between.
That's very good, because I was just about to ask a question. The blockchain governance has the possibility of being very private, but at the same time, it's essentially a giant ledger. So it also has the potential to be this weird dystopian view where everyone can see what everyone's doing all the time. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Well, and I think when it comes down to it, I view this technology as providing options, as providing freedom to make choices that we don't have in the traditional legal setting. And that's what's so interesting to me about this. One last point on arbitration that I think I think you'll really enjoy hearing about, and I think the listeners will too, is with arbitration, there's superior enforcement to traditional local law. And let me explain why. If you and I have a dispute, let's say that I'm based in Chicago. Actually, let's back up. Let's say that I happen to be in Australia today. So let's say that I'm based in Australia and you're based in the US. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say we have a dispute. And if you were to take me to court, let's say we had a business agreement and I did something terrible. And so you were to go to traditional court where you are in the US and get a judgment against me. How would you enforce that judgment? In a traditional law setting. What you would have to do is you would have to come to Australia and ask the court in Australia, assuming I was a resident here, you would have to ask the court in Australia, Your Honor, would you please enforce this against Miss Morgan? And because of the principles of sovereignty, the court can say, no, you know what, Joe, I'm not interested. I don't want to. And for whatever reason or no reason at all, they can decide not to enforce that judgment. And the reason is because of the principles of sovereignty. Juxtapose that with an arbitration award. There's something called the New York Convention. And what it is for practical purposes is an international treaty where more than 100 nations have signed on. And nations all around the world have agreed that they will enforce arbitration awards from other sovereigns. So let's go back to the scenario where you and I have a disagreement, but instead of going to traditional court, you follow our agreement and you get an arbitration award against me. You come to Australia and you attempt to enforce it. And the conversation is very different. In this case, you say to the judge, Your Honor, I have a judgment against Ms. Morgan, and I'd like for you to enforce it. And pursuant to international treaty, you need to go ahead and do that for me. In other words, it's no longer discretionary. So you have a much more powerful tool should you need to avail yourself of getting assets in that way. So the enforcement side of this is also very interesting, and it's superior to a traditional court mechanism. So not only do we get all of the choices of who are going to be our judges and what does the hearing look like, we can cap how long it's going to be, all of these other benefits, but we also get superior enforcement if we need to do that, and hopefully we don't.
Wow, that's amazing. That's going to make a world of difference in a much more globalized world where people are moving much more frequently.
Exactly. And I love the idea of using traditional systems to enforce all dispute resolution mechanisms. I think that's a beautiful thing.
Oh, it absolutely is. And there's plenty of applications to blockchain. Do you mind if I ask you a couple questions about some of the more far out ones?
Absolutely.
All right, fantastic. So I'm sure you've heard of blockchain land registration.
I have.
So what are your views on it, and what impact can it have, especially in the developing world?
I think using a open public blockchain for land registry is a really interesting idea. And here, I grew up in the area, and I don't know how familiar you are with Detroit and County and those sorts of things, but during the crisis, there was an interesting and unfortunate situation that was happening particularly in Wayne County, where Detroit is located. And this has directly to do with title. So what was happening was there was a delay between the time that a deed was recorded or a mortgage was recorded with the clerk's office and the time that it made it into the actual books. There was about a 3-month delay. So what happened was people were taking advantage of that 3-month delay, and they were selling their property to multiple buyers who all did a title search and thought that they were buying the property free and clear, when in fact the owner had already sold it 2 days before, 3 days before, a week before.
Ugh.
So they were taking advantage. Yeah, I know. Could you imagine?
No.
It's a horrible and unnecessary risk. So by moving title to something that's instantaneous, like an open public blockchain, we eliminate that entire opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean that it's perfect, and it doesn't mean that challenges won't arise. But I think that the ability to have instantaneous and open public records I think that's moving in the right direction.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful, and I'm glad that we were talked a little bit about land registry, but there's also people are continuing to talk about using blockchain technology for cities, specifically the idea of a token representing ownership in a private city. Do you think in the future we can ICO a private city?
That's a great question. I think that based on the current situation with ICOs, I would say that you can ICO anything or nothing. But I think it's a really, really interesting idea. I don't know how that works in reality, and I don't think anyone knows until we try it.
It is a very hard problem, and I've been thinking about it quite frequently. Like, is there a way that you can make a token have voting shares and make some tokens merely just get dividends of increases in value? I wouldn't know how to do it because I would see there'd be a problem with it, right? If someone is malevolent, say, they buy a lot of these tokens, couldn't they just destroy the private city?
Absolutely, just as a hostile takeover happens in traditional corporations.
Exactly. It's a bit of a conundrum. I'm hopeful to see some sort of startup do that. Unfortunately, it may have some devastating consequences.
Well, and I think it's important to remember that we are in a time of experimentation.
Yes.
This technology is so new, and a lot of us who are in it every day are frustrated because we feel like it's been here forever and we want to see all of these things happening. And I think sometimes it's good to take a step back and recognize that this technology is still in its infancy. And I think that's part of the excitement. It's a giant experiment, and we get to try all of these things. We get to try things like the DAO and then have it crash. And while I'm sure that the people who lost a lot of money on the DAO wish that didn't happen, and certainly I wish that for them as well, these sorts of growing pains are part of what helps us to develop robust smart contracts. It's part of the growing pains that get us to where we want to be, where we can actually, for example, manage a city using tokens. I think one of the most important things to recognize, though, is that we don't get there until we teach people how to securely manage their own tokens.
So I'm so glad that you mentioned the DAO, especially in relation to blockchain law. A lot of people before the DAO were constantly saying, we don't even need lawyers anymore. We simply have code be the law. There'd be no need for adjudication. What do you think about what happened to the DAO, and what does that say about the necessity of lawyers in the blockchain space in the future?
I'm going to reply to that with a bigger question, and that is, I don't think that it's a question of whether or not we need quote unquote lawyers. The question is, do we need effective dispute resolution? And I think the answer to that is yes. Although I will point out that there's a risk with that. I hear a lot of people talking about, and I'm a big fan of adding dispute resolution to contracts and whatnot. But when we couple unstoppable smart contracts and code with the idea of having a pause button or an interference option, we have to remember that every time we open that door, some undesirables might come in, right? So for example, if we have a smart contract that can be reversed or put on hold for adjudication, that also represents a risk. And so I think we will develop smart contracts. Some of them will have options to have unstoppable code, quote unquote, stopped by a third party, and other code won't be. And I think does that make sense to you?
A little bit. Could you explain a little further?
Sure. Because yeah, I felt like I didn't do a good job of explaining that. Let me try again. When we operate in the traditional world, there's a backdrop of having someone to go to get justice somewhere, at least in an ideal sense, maybe not necessarily in a practical sense, but in an ideal sense, that if someone wrongs us, if another community member wrongs us, that there is some opportunity for justice. When we're dealing in code, and specifically smart contract code that may or may not have a stop button, there are implications in society, right? So the DAO is an example of this. When we saw people invest in the DAO, a moral question arose, and that moral question was, do we undo this unintended consequence, or do we let it stand? And now we have ETH and ETC.
And it even has a stranger implication that the person who hacked into the DAO, because it was pure smart contracts, there was the question of whether it was completely legal for him to take all the tokens. And in fact,
exactly.
he said he was a white hat hacker.
Exactly. I mean, even the question of, can you label this person as a hacker? If someone used the code as it was written and got an advantage, while we might find that morally repugnant, is that quote unquote illegal? I mean, particularly if the terms and conditions as to which people, particularly if the understanding when people invested in it was the code is going to run as it is here, buyer beware. I don't know whether or not that's fair or just. And importantly, I don't think it's my choice to make. I don't think it's any one lawyer's choice to make. That's what I love about this technology, is that it's a community choice. And so part of the community decided, no, we're not going to let this stand. And another part of the community said, wait a minute, we want to run unstoppable code. And that means dealing with some undesirable outcomes.
Interesting. Well,
we get to align ourselves, you and I get to align ourselves with either or both or none. And that's what's interesting for me, at least, about this technology and about how the law develops within it.
I love how you keep hammering back to the principle of choice, and that's absolutely the case. And on that note, I'm gonna my last question is gonna allow you to be as idealistic and imaginative as possible. And I'm gonna ask you, what do you see this ecosystem being in 20 years? What is your ideal vision of the world 20 years from now in blockchain tech, in governance tech?
That's a great question. It's such a big question because you framed it in a way as what do I want to have happen? Mm-hmm. It's a much more nuanced question than, how do you see this technology developing in 20 years, right? Because mm-hmm. I think the reality is not to be simplistic about it, but I think that there are effectively two factions. I think that there's one side that is attempting to use this technology to recreate the status quo,
right,
and enhance power, mm-hmm. and enhance existing power systems, and improve their profit margins by 2 to 5%. And that is their vision. I don't share that vision. My vision is that this technology can disrupt the existing power systems, not for the sake of disruption, but because they don't actually serve people. And I'd like to see this be a tool of empowerment for individuals, a way that we can make choices that we don't otherwise have, meaningful choices that we don't otherwise have in the world today. So I would like to see this as a tool as a way for us to move away from relying on third parties to control our money, relying on third parties to control our data, and moving to a more individual, I control my money, I know how to control my keys, I can make choices on who I engage with and what I do. That's the kind of future I want to see.
Pamela Morgan wants this creative destruction for personal autonomy. Thank you for joining us at the Startup Society's podcast. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.